ni Nesika, Kitimitwan, Jill Nigawe, Robert Nipapa, Su Nikukam, Kanze, Nigasum, Apsis Ninehewan. Hello, my name is Lord Rojhon. I am from up north. Jill is my mother, Robert my father, Sue my grandmother, and Kin my grandfather. I speak a little bit of Cree. Thank you all for joining me tonight for a bit of a language share. We're going to start with the history of the Nehian or Nehio language, mundanely referred to as the Cree language. I am a Northern Cree Indian. First Nationer is actually how I prefer to be called. I am Northern Nehio. And this is my language. I will admit it is not the easiest language, but it is one of the oldest. So the Nehio language dates back over 10,000 years, and it actually is a written language as well as a spoken language. The first symbol we were given is it's a sevenfold symbol. So it is, I had all my flashcards here. There it is. So it's a very simple symbol. It's this. And it is known as the first symbol or the first sentence. Each line represents a different sentence structure. And this is actually a very simple sentence. It roughly translates to, I see a bear. And is our first sample of Indigenous writing, or at least for my nation. So the Nahio Nation comprises everything from Rocky Mountains up in Canada all the way down to the Florida Panhandle. And the really cool thing about this is Nahio is a genderless language. So if you're familiar, as most of us are, with European language, everything has a gender. Are these symbols pictographic, like cuneiform, or is it symbolic, like the English alphabet? Neither, actually. It's neither pictographic nor symbolic. It is wholly its own thing. Each symbol represents a whole concept and can then be broken down into smaller and smaller parts. Does that answer your question? I hope it does. Excellent. Yes, but as I said, it's a genderless language. So we don't say, you know, the boy ran to pick up the ball. We would say something like, the brown-eyed one went to pick up the ball, or the blue-shirted one went to pick up the ball. So we use a descriptor of a person or a name of a person instead of a gender. And this is one of the few languages that I have run across that actually does that. It's a completely neutral language. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's really, really beautiful in its own way. So along with our history of language, I also wanted to teach you all how to say some basic words. Sorry, I'm getting off track. I get so excited to teach that sometimes I forget my lesson plan. But yeah, so Nahio language has been around for over 10,000 years. It is a living language. Many of the words that we started with have slightly different meanings than when they began. And part of that is through the history of colonialism and the colonialist violence that has shaped our language and changed our language, as well as interaction with non-Turtle Islanders, with European cultures and non-European cultures alike. So our language is different today than it was 10,000 years ago, but so is every language. And it's still very much a living and learning language. I don't think it's the hardest language in the world, but then again, it's a language that I've had the fortune of hearing spoken most of my life. Unfortunately, that's not a great privilege for everyone. So the first word I would like to teach you is tanse. Hello. Oh, yes, we have a wonderful question. What is Turtle Island? This, North America, is Turtle Island. We have a wonderful story that when the people of the earth began to fight too much, the grandfather spirit came and flooded the earth, and in order to give us new land, one of the few heroes that survived it and the animals got together and they basically went to the bottom of the river. They got some mud, they put it on the back of the turtle, and they made new land. It's a beautiful story. You can find amazing retellings of it from different nations on YouTube. I highly recommend you go look it up. So that is Turtle Island. So yeah, the first word I'm going to teach you is tanse. Pronounced tan, se. Tanse. It means hello. So tanse is a very informal greeting. It's something that you would do with friends, with family, with friends you haven't met yet. It's something that I would say to anyone I saw on the street. Tanse, hello. It is a friendly greeting, kind of like a hey, what's up, Tanse.
Let me ask you a quick question just to kind of get my mind wrapped around it. If there's not masculine and feminine uses of the word, do you have singular and plural like other languages would do, where where there are other declensions that this is, you're not going to have masculine singular, but you're going to have singular, and I guess, do you have a plural?
Yes, we do. We have singulars, we have others, and we have plurals, and then we have singular plurals and other plurals. So
Are you declining the verbs? Like in a sentence, like most, like Italian, Danish, all this is declined around the verbs, like see, saw, seen, I have seen, I have saw, we have seen before, whatever, that's your declension. Does it work around that basis, or does it have a different center?
It centers more around the person speaking than the people being described. So if I was gonna say, like my nephews.
So the key, that's a 2-word sentence, but the key part is more the my rather than the nephew?
So actually it would split into 3 parts. Ni, which is my. Ti, which is your. And then ne, which is child.
So technically there is no word for nephew. You would describe it as, you know, your child or sister's child or however you're going to describe it, but there's not a formal word for a specific word for nephew. Is that what I'm getting?
In certain dialects there are. So because the Nahio people covered such a large swath of territory, there are 5 different distinct dialects. I speak the Y dialect, which is the common northern dialect, and we don't have a specific word for like niece or nephew, but we do have a word for sibling, and we have a word for child, so sibling's child.
If there's 5 different dialects, like if I take all the Scandinavian languages, if I speak one, I can communicate. Like if I speak Swedish, I can talk to somebody in Norwegian enough to converse and ask basic things, stuff like that. It's not going to be exact, but 60% of the language translates over or something like that, so that you can communicate. Is that true for the different dialects, that like if I spoke one dialect and you speak another, that we can at least communicate, if not be very technical or very descriptive?
Yes. Actually, that's a really good question, and that's a really good thing to point out. I have friends that speak different dialects than I do, and we are able to communicate without much issue. The pronunciations are a little bit different, and sometimes we have to go back and redefine what we mean. Like for instance, ne ni nehewan, a small Cree, is the Y dialect. Ne ni nihiwan is a TH dialect. So they're similar.
They're pretty close. I mean, in broad strokes, they're close, but I'm sure to somebody who's used to one over the other, that's a big difference.
Think of it as the difference between someone who has lived in Brooklyn their whole life and someone who has lived in like Atlanta their whole life. You can still communicate, but the way you communicate is going to be a little different. You can still understand the language,
but the words you choose to use and how you pronounce them are going to be distinctly different. Absolutely.
Right. Like color with a U or color without a U.
Thanks. That answered my question. That kind of let because I'm a linguist by training, and that's what I'm thinking about in terms of the big picture and how you would decline things and stuff like that. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's absolutely a valid question, and I'm glad I could help you make sense of it. Yeah, and that's the fun thing about language is it changes based on where you are. And dialects change a little bit too. But broadly, we can all kind of get the same base concept across within our language. I highly recommend anyone who is interested. There is an online Cree dictionary that is completely free. And one of my favorite things to look up is all of the different dialects. And they also keep a running tally of how many words, different versions of a word there are. For instance, my favorite one is makwa, or bear. There are 116 different ways to say bear. So it all depends on how descriptive you want to be and which dialect you're speaking. There's words for like sleeping bear, running bear, hunting bear, bear that you have hunted, living bears, dead bears. It's an amazing, amazing language. So the next thing I wanted to teach you all is the base introduction. So you would say your name and then Nisigasan. You put your name and then Ni-si-i-ga-san. Nisigasan. My name is. And that's a very important part of any introduction. And it's also a less formal introduction. So a formal introduction, which is what I did, is actually I gave like a mid-formal. It's your name, all of the places you are from, and your entire family. So I only introduced myself, my region, and 4 family members. Whereas if I was doing a very formal introduction, like if I was going to introduce myself, I live in the Mid-Realm. If I was going to introduce myself in my language to the King of the Mid-Realm, I would tell him, I am from up north. I am from the southern part of the north. I am from Cleveland, in the territory of Ohio. And then I would introduce myself as I am from my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, my father, my brother, as well as any important extended relatives. So if I had a relative who was like a duke or a duchess, I would also introduce myself as part of their family line. That's a good question. Which set of grandparents do you introduce? All 4? Just maternal, just paternal? What if someone got divorced or remarried? So let me answer those questions. I only introduce my paternal family because they are my Cree side of the family. If I had 2 halves of an indigenous family, right, if my mom's side was also indigenous, I would also introduce her family. If my parents were to get divorced, I would still introduce my mother, but then if my father got remarried, I would have the subcategory of this is my second mother. This is the woman who birthed me. This is my stepmother. However, that can also change. So if your mother, let's say, for an example, your mother was, you were adopted, you don't know who your mother was, you would list the woman who raised you as your mother. Or if for whatever reason, you have a very bad relationship with your mother, you don't have to introduce her. You can introduce the person that you see as your maternal figure, even if they're not biologically yours. Does that answer questions? Awesome, excellent.
Well, I'll just ask this instead. Is the emphasis on like your immediate family, or is it more on importance, like If you had somebody that was a famous ancestor who would be, very well thought of, have prestige, do you list that first? Is that the most important thing, or does it depend on who you're talking to and in what context you're talking as to what you'll list things?
So that is an excellent question. So it really, what really matters is the context of what you're introducing yourself for. So if you and I have just met, my introduction to you would be very informal. If you are a person of prestige and we're just happening to meet, I would list, I would do basically the same introduction I did today, where I'm from, the main people in my life as, importance. If we were meeting to arrange like a contract or something of importance, and I had, a relative who was like a well-known lawyer, I would introduce them before my grandparents, as kind of like a, hey, we're in this legal situation. This is my relative, and their skill set is extremely important in this situation. So they go first, and then the rest of my family.
Are there any such things as like nicknames or family names? And I'll give you kind of, for instance, like in Icelandic, if my name is James Jameson, that means my dad's name is James and I'm his son, James Jameson. Okay, but I'm going to have within my family, you might be called Dirty Britches, or it's going to be some nickname, and it's usually derogatory, kind of, that they're giving you grief. But that's what you're known by within your family. And kind of like where I'm from in the States, well, you're Bob's son, Ralph, that's how, so you're almost with that same naming tradition, because your name would be Ralph Bobson or Robertson. Like my actual last name is Robertson, so that's where that comes from. And then they have some little things, and then if I was, dealing with the Prime Minister of Canada, you're a lot more formal. Do you guys have anything that's like in that context, or is that just a different concept?
So in things like nicknames, um, I actually have multiple names in my language. I have my government name, which has since changed since I was a child. I have the name that I picked at my naming ceremony when I came of age. And then I have the name that I took when I went through a specific ceremony to be recognized as someone with certain sorry, it's kind of hard to explain because it is a closed ceremony. But basically I am a two-spirit individual. And in my culture I have specific rituals that I am supposed to participate in. And so I have a name for when I do.
It's a significance along your pathway of life that it kind of marks certain developmental places, yeah, or more than that.
Yes. So my spiritual name, which is what I use in ceremony, is a name that is only used in those ceremonies, and only by the spirits and by the other people that are performing the ceremony that know my name, because names have power and they have significance. So that name is only used in those situations. Whereas my regular name, my nation name, which I chose when I came of age, anyone can use. My nation name is Red Bear, so anyone could call me that. But not anyone could use my
Does it go into like certain cultures have, that's my true name, and if you know my true name, it gives you power over me, or that's a concept that some people have, that in within their culture. So is it somewhere along those lines, or at least started off that way?
Yes and no. Names do have power. Words are important. What you call something or someone is important if you are going to bring it into a spiritual space. But it's not like if I tell the fairies my name, they're going to steal it.
Or that they can use it in a spell to bind me or to control me or something, because there are cultures
Right.
who have that idea. That's a concept within their cultural identity.
Right. So my cultural identity is very much trying to think of a good way to explain this. So yeah, the name is important, but it's not like the power of Christ compels you. You're not going, if you knew my spiritual name, you aren't going to be able to have power over me. It just means that you know a deeper part of my soul, which is why we don't share those names willy-nilly, because not everyone is worthy of knowing that piece of you.
You could do 3 more classes. I mean, one just on the language, but you can do the cultural, how language fits within the culture and what the culture is and what cultural ideas are and how society views itself and other members. I mean, I could think of 10 classes you could do just on that, because I could ask questions for forever.
Absolutely. I'll definitely come and teach more. But also I would like to shout out, there is going to be a new World Symposium on May 15th, which is all about Indigenous cultures. And myself and other Indigenous Scadians are going to be teaching all of these classes on culture, on clothing, on language, on history, on specific pieces like regalia. I'm putting together my class proposal right now for Indigenous music, beadwork, the significance of regalia. Yeah, so I wanted to shout them out. Everyone should definitely look them up. It's going to be amazing. And also there's the New World Personas Facebook page, where I'm more than happy to ramble at you all day about this. So there's a question in the chat. Would like to know more about our written language and how it works. So the written language is, it's tricky, is what it is. I'm much better at the spoken language than the written language, because I am a dyslexic person and learning to write English was hard enough. So I focused on writing one language instead of multiple. But ooh, that's a good question. I'll answer that in a minute. Let me finish your answer on the written language. So you take the pieces of a symbol apart and you spread it out, and that's how you get your word. It's a little tricky. So if we take our simple sentence, this line here at the top, ni, I. The curve to the flat line is saw. Bear. And then this is the descriptor of what it was doing. So fishing. So I saw a bear fishing. It's very interesting how it kind of smushes together. Like I said, unfortunately, the written language is not my expertise. I worked on learning to speak it. What sounds exist in Cree that do not exist in English? And are all sentences put into triangles? No, all sentences are not put into triangles. There are squares, there are circles, dots. Some are just a amalgamation of all of their letters kind of stuck together in a weird shape. It's a fun language. And sounds that exist in Cree that do not exist in English. I will get into that as we continue down this road. So we have our first two parts of our introduction. We have Tanse, hello. And we have our name, followed by Nisiigasan. Nisiigasan. My blank is my name. So Lord Rojhon Nisiigasan is my name. The next thing that the rest of you need to learn to say is this. Apsis Nineheoan. I speak a little bit of Cree. So the first part of this, Apsisi. I speak. And this is an important word, Apsisi, because it is used culturally as a statement of significance. So if I got up and I said Apsisi, it's kind of like a call to attention. I speak. It's kind of a power grab, which is fun. But if you say it softer, Apsisi, it's I speak. I'm telling you a true thing. The different inflections can change its meaning a little bit. If you say it a little snarky, like Apsisi, I hear you, I'm talking. You can put a little attitude on it. And that's fun. And then we have Ninehioan, a little bit of Cree. Now, if we look at Nine, a little bit, that's, good if you're talking about measurements for most folk. However, it's also good if you're talking about your emotional state. Like I'm not feeling good. Ninehi, I'm feeling a little sad. I'm feeling a little unwell. It's a way to quantify. And then Hiowan, Nehiowan is Cree. So that is your basic introduction. And when you put it all together, you have Tanse, Lord Rojhon Nasigasan, Apsis Ninehiowan. My name, hello. My name is Lord Rojhon. I speak a little bit of Cree. And, you know, I can go on for hours about the different ways the dialects interact with each other, but that is how you would introduce yourself in my dialect, in the Y dialect, the Northern dialect. So sounds that do not exist in English that exist in Cree. Well, most humans make most sounds. It's just not every sound has a linguistic significance. Let's see, a good example of that. Nay, which most people think is a form of no in English. Nay, I say nay, a naysayer. But in Cree, nay, N-E-E-E, is kind of a flirtatious saying. So if someone says, you know, oh, you're so pretty, nay. It's an I agree and I hear you kind of a saying. Other sounds. There's a really good example of this in music. So in Indigenous music, there's something called a lead. And a lot of people, if you're listening to powwow music, they think it's just a scream. But the way in which a lead is done specifically leads to the emotion that the piece is meant to take. So there's jubilant screams, there's screams of hatred, screams of love, screams of war. And I'm using the word scream, which isn't actually even the best way to describe it. I live with roommates. Otherwise, I would demonstrate it for you. But the walls are thin and I don't want to give anyone a heart attack with unexpected screaming. But yeah, those are some of the words that exist in Nehio that don't really exist in Cree, and some of the sounds are of those words are different too. I hope that answers your question. I'd like to open it up if there are any more questions. If there's anything people want more specifics on. Do we have anything coming in from Facebook? Anybody here in the Zoom have more questions?
Nope, no questions from the live stream on Facebook. Do you know how, like, okay, we've got, like, in English, you use an alphabet structure, A, B, C, and then you've got Cyrillic languages, you use a slightly different alphabet, and then you've got runes and, you know, Futhark, all these different sets. What is there a set of formalized letters, numbers, symbols, whatever you want to call them, that are used for you guys for the language to write in? Like, how many letters does it have to it, or symbols?
So there is a formalized written language. It is, I don't want to say new. It is having a resurgence. So a lot of our written language as well as our spoken language has shifted, and some of it has been lost. So there are symbols and letters that we have that we don't really know what they were supposed to have meant. I speak Nehio, but I unfortunately am unable to read or write it. So I'm not the best person to ask about written language. However, there is an amazing YouTube video from a Plains Cree man in the Canadian National Library. And if you just Google Cree language, it should pop up. But if you give me a minute, I can pull it up and drop it in the chat. And he goes into it much better than I can, of the different dialects and the different letters that are used. So yes, there are letters. There is an alphabet, but I am much more experienced with the spoken dialect, and so don't want to speak on the written dialect, which I am unfortunately mostly illiterate in. I can make out simple sentences that I have seen other people write and know what they mean, but unfortunately I can't just like read it. Are there any other questions? Absolutely.
It's been one question. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. What's the question?
You've got a question that somebody wrote in the chat. I was trying to see who actually wrote it. It asks, are there guttural sounds in Cree? So far, the sounds you've demonstrated are all front of the mouth sounds.
So Cree is spoken a lot more in the front of the mouth for conversational speaking, but when you want to change the inflection or change the meaning, it does become more of a back of the throat language. Like if I am really, really upset with someone, then I drop the language from the front of my mouth to the back of my mouth. And it's kind of an auditory cue. Like if I'm talking to you, I would say Epsisi, I'm speaking. But if I'm really mad at you, I drop it lower. CC. And it sits lower in the throat. And Two-Spirit isn't exactly a translatable thing, but in English, so pronouns. What are my pronouns? I use he and they as my pronouns in traditionally colonialist spaces, so in the broader society. But when I go into ceremonial spaces, I have specific Nahio pronouns that I use that are used by my people. Two-Spirit it doesn't actually belong to, the word itself, Two-Spirit, doesn't actually belong specifically to the Nahio people. It belongs to Indigenous people as a whole, because we lost the language around different gender identities. And so I've had to try and come up with our own ways of explaining it. And the other question is, how do you say goodbye? We don't. We never say goodbye. We say until we meet again. So the best way to say until we meet again, the simplest way is probably sitanse, which is again hello. So until we say hello again. Are there any further questions? Anything that people want more clarified?
Are there any examples of like, and I don't really care which language it was pulled from, but like you take, okay, like the word boudoir in English is the same as is in French because we just took their word. We didn't have a word for it. We didn't make up a word. We just took their word. Is there any examples of that or slang from other, even, like the 1500s on back drifting into your language?
Oh, I was really hoping I'd get asked this question. My favorite word that this has been brought in from is actually a Métis Inuit word that has kind of filtered down into Northern Cree, which is kulungeta. It's so a kulungeta is basically a useless man. It's kind of the equivalent of a bastard. And it's one of my favorite words to say because it's just kind of it's fun in my mouth to say. But also it's good to have a word that you can use when you're really mad at someone sometimes. And a lot of people, myself included, I use kulingeta for men, for women, when I run my foot into the coffee table. It's a very good kind of generic. I guess it's a swear word. Have you learned to if you can walk away without being able to say at least one bad word?
Well, it's kind of a swear word without swearing. Like it reminds me, like, I think probably all different cultures have one of those. Like my grandfather's word for somebody like that, he called him an oxygen thief. That was, that you're so worthless that you steal the very air you breathe. You're an oxygen thief. And that was his concept around it. And I'm sure that came from like his great grandfolks, but I think everybody has stuff like that, don't they? And we're like cultures are a lot more alike than they are different when you start looking at things.
Yeah, I mean they really can be. Um, you know, language has for several hundred years just kind of become a linguistic soup. Um, Especially as English has tried to become the language of the world and just taken words from other cultures willy-nilly. Um, but in my language, my Nahil language, we've done that a bit with certain other tribes that we've come in contact with other nations. Um, we've over the history of colonialist violence, we have taken obviously English, French, and Spanish as the main ones. Though if you get up into Alaska, they also have Russian, which that's fun. um, and brought it into our more modern version. Uh, but in within SCA period, it's mostly our language as well as certain bits from other tribes. If that answers your question.
It does. I was just kind of curious, like, if you're taking words from Inuit, because I don't really have any idea about the intricacies of Inuit, is it a similar language to you guys, or is it as different as English is to Cree?
Um, it's so indigenous language comes from one base language and has since splintered out. So it's kind of like you take Latin and then you have Spanish and French and Italian and the Romance languages.
Yeah, they're all vulgarized Latin.
So we have the language of the first peoples, which is then split out into the different nations. So we have some similarities. And if you spend enough time with the other nations, you can start picking up bits and pieces of most indigenous languages. I say most because there's a reason that the Navajo were used for code talkers, because nobody else. I have sat around people speaking Navajo at the Gathering of Nations for years and listened, and I still have no clue what they're saying. They went completely off in their own direction. They are the English of the Romance dialects of Turtle Island. You know, someone's always got to come up with their own thing.
Okay, no more questions from the Facebook live stream.
Do we have any more questions here on Zoom? You can take Navajo lessons on Duolingo. That's one of their ways of preserving their language. I will say, as difficult as Cree is for non-native speakers, Navajo is worse. My personal opinion. So if you would like to learn to speak Navajo, you know, more power to you. But just bear in mind, it's gonna be difficult.
Is there a base language other than English that would be a good start? You know, like some things, like, okay, if you're going to take certain things, if I understand Latin, that gives me a hand up, especially if I was going to take medical terminology or something as a profession anyways, because there's a lot of Latin that goes into that. And it's not a bad starting place other than English. Is there a similar thing that, you know, that you could go that might be more English friendly to start you off on the step, and then you go from there to another step that would make it easier, or no?
If you're trying to learn specifically Navajo, there's not much I personally recommend other than just jumping head first into it. But if you're looking at, like, you want to learn Cree, any of the Cree dialects, there are some amazing YouTube sources. There is a Cree Word of the Day channel on YouTube, and they go through all of the Cree dialects each day with each word. So they go through the Y dialect, the TH dialect, the neutral dialect, the M dialect, all 5 dialects. If you're interested in any other indigenous language, I, like, as a stepping stone, I would look at Anishinaabe as a good place to start, because they are the closest to the very, very base language. So Cree and Anishinaabe are probably, I think, and this is just my 2 cents, I think they are the easiest to learn. No indigenous language is going to be necessarily easy. And if you are a non-indigenous person, be aware that those language structures might be very difficult for you. And they also might, the people that are teaching it also may not want to teach you. So obviously, look, if you are a non-Indigenous person, find someone who is willing to teach you, but also understand that we are fighting to preserve our own language. And so in those classes, the seats are usually reserved for Indigenous people first. Which is not to discourage you from learning new things. But just be aware that if, it's like a class like this and you have to sign up for it, you may get booted if there's an Indigenous person that needs your seat. Are there living Cree that speak strictly Cree? Yes. Hello. There are more of us now than there were 15 years ago. Because we are finally allowed to teach it in school. It used to be that even on reservation schools, you couldn't teach the language. Our culture was illegal until 1976. So, there is post-SCA history of Indigenous people that is very important that you learn if you're going to have an Indigenous persona or are interested in Indigenous history or Indigenous language, because we are living cultures with living issues. And if you're going to portray an Indigenous persona, you should be aware of those as well. Because as an Indigenous person, when I first joined the SCA, I was not able to portray a Cree persona. And it has been 6 years in the SCA, and I'm only recently been able to teach Indigenous history and Indigenous culture and have an Indigenous persona. And yes, Cree Simon Says is the YouTube channel for the Cree word of the day. Do we have any final questions, comments, concerns? Is there anything one should be aware of regarding social sensitivity to Native peoples when trying to learn more of the Cree language? Learn from an actual Indigenous person. There unfortunately have been non-Indigenous people trying to teach us our languages. So if you're going to learn, make sure that it is from an actual Indigenous person. So the Cree Simon Says YouTube channel. Check your instructors. If you're doing anything through like a library or any of the museums of Indigenous culture, they will have Indigenous teachers, but I would be skeptical of just some random person on the internet saying, I can teach you how to speak Cree. And also be aware that Indigenous people aren't required to share their culture with you. I share my culture because that's important to me, and it's important to my community, and some of our spiritual beliefs to share our aspects of our culture, but there are going to be things that are off limits to you. We have any other questions?
Did you I did a quick search on Google. There were several Cree dictionaries that pop up. Is there one that you think is a better source than others, or one that you prefer?
Yeah, let me pull it up and I'll drop the link in the chat. So for those of you on Facebook Live, creedictionary.com is what I use. It's in the chat, but I don't know if people on Facebook can see the chat.
Not the Zoom chat, they can't.
I didn't want anyone that was watching from the comfort of Facebook to miss out. Do we have any other questions? All right, well, that is all I have for all of you tonight. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for teaching for us.
Absolutely. If there are going to be more ERUM classes, I will definitely teach more. And you all can, I highly recommend you look up either the New World Personas Facebook page or the New World Symposium if you want to learn more. You can always ask me more questions. I love to share.